All right, so a quick review from Math 1 on evaluating functions. And the first thing we're going to talk about is this function notation, right? And when I look at function notation, you always have what we call a name and then the input, okay? Now, when I read this as, right, h of x, meaning the name of my function is h, and x represents the input value for this, okay? Now, once we input something, right, that produces an output. So when I look at this, right, whenever we evaluate a function, the first thing we do is we substitute the value of the variable, and once we substitute the value of the variable, we evaluate it using proper order of operations, okay? So when I look at it, right, the first one here says find g of 6 if f of x equals 4 to the x and g of x equals negative 2x plus 8. Now the one reason we name functions, right, is so that like a lot of times in like junior high math they teach you, y equals y equals y equals. Well, if you're dealing with a bunch of different functions, how do you distinguish the difference between which one to use? So naming the function using function notation tells you which function to use, and then it makes it easy to input, all right, a certain value. So when I look at g of 6, I know I'm going to use function g, and I'm going to input 6 for x. So if I want to evaluate g of 6, I'm going to use this function, and everywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a 6. So negative 2 times 6 plus 8. So g of 6 would be negative 12 plus 8, which would be negative 4. Okay? So g of 6, right? So g is the name, 6 is the input, negative 4 would be the output. So let's look at this next one. We're given 4 functions here, right? Function f, function g, function h, function t. And they want us to evaluate t of 4. So if I want to evaluate t of 4, it's telling me to use this function here, and everywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a 4. So t of 4 is equal to 3 times 2 to the 4 minus 1 power, which would give me 3 times 2 to the third. And if I do order of operations here, 2 to the third would be 8, right? And 3 times 8 would be 24. So t of 4 would be 24. Okay, the next one, f of 5. Well, since I'm using function f, I know I have to use this function here, and everywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a 5. So f of 5 equals 3 times 5 minus 2. So f of 5 would equal 15 minus 2, which would equal 13. Okay? Then h of 6 tells me I'm going to use function h, and everywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a 6. So h of 6 equals 4 times 6 minus 1 plus 7, which gives me 4 times, remember parentheses first, 6 minus 1 is 5. 4 times 5 is 20, plus 7 would be 27. Okay? So with this, this just basically gives you an idea of what function to use and what your input value is. Now when we go and look at a table, right? Remember, this is your set of inputs. This is your set of outputs. Okay? So if they want me to find f of 6, what is the value of f of x when x is equal to 6? When x is equal to 6, what's your output, right? F of 6 would equal 29. Okay? Now, here it says when f of x, right? When f of x is equal to 19, right? What is the value of f of x minus 1? Now this is tricky, right? Because when I look at it, they're looking for, if you remember, what we used to call the previous term. Okay? So if f of x is equal to 19, right? I know x was equal to 4. So what is the value of f of x minus 1, right? Well, that would be f of 4 minus 1, which would be f of 3, and f of 3 would be 14. Remember, f of x minus 1 tells you, right? If I go to the previous term, what's my output? My output would be 14. So try the next one on your own and come back and check your answer. So if f of x is equal to 29, right? What is the value of x minus 1? Right? Well, here, notice this is what's x minus 1, not f of x minus 1. So if f of x is equal to 29, right, my input value would be 6. So f of 6 equals 29. So what is 6 minus 1? That would be 5. And then what would be f of 10? So when I go to the input of 10, I don't see it here. But if I look for the pattern here, I go up 5, up 5, up 5. So here, f of 9, I would go up 5 to 44. Then up another 5 to 49. Okay? So, next one. Evaluate the functions given the table. What is g of 4? Well, I know I'm going to look in this column, right, with an input of 4, and right away I'll see this would be equal to negative 5. H of 8, right? I'm using this function with this input, which means that would be equal to 8. F of negative 2, use this function with this input, puts me at negative 7. And then g of negative 2 right away would just be 7. Okay, so evaluating functions, this should be a pretty easy, straightforward, section. So let's make sure we go ahead and try the homework.